When it comes to manga, there are two factors that are universally the most important details. These two factors are known as the artwork and the writing. The writing can be summed up as mostly dialogue, but the artwork is far more complicated. I mean, these are the only two ways one experiences the story. Without the artwork, you would be reading a light novel, and without the writing, you would be on Instagram. For a manga, the most effective way to convey its story is to not just put random characters and throw words on it, but to have each panel tell a story. And this is what separates manga art versus art. So while he definitely is not the greatest artist in the world, I genuinely believe Tite Kubo is the best manga artist in the world, as he took this principle to its absolute limit to fit the mood and atmosphere of his story. And while his character designs are unmatched, I still find some mangas with just better overall artwork with detail like Berserk and Somali and the Forest Spirit. And while I agree they have better detail, I still believe that Kubo's artwork is better for storytelling purposes. That doesn't mean that Berserk and Somali don't convey manga art well in the storytelling department, as although I have yet to finish the second arc, Berserk already has some amazing panels in terms of storytelling. I'm simply saying I just prefer Bleach's. However, it wasn't always like that. You see, although Kubo was always a great artist, his artwork constantly evolved like many long-running mangakas do. However, unlike most other mangakas, Kubo evolves his artwork differently to fit solely with the story tone of Bleach. Tite Kubo has had 6 different major style changes. The first one would be in the Agent of the Shinigami arc, the second the Soul Society arc, the third the Arrancar arc, the fourth the Fullbring arc, and the fifth the Thousand Year Blood War, and finally Burn the Witch and the afterworks of Bleach. Overall, today we are obviously discussing the evolution of the artwork inside of the story of Bleach. But before we get into that, welcome to my channel. My name is Pokesel and I produce mostly Bleach related content. I am absolutely thrilled that you guys decided to show up and just say hello and watch today's video. If you guys are new though and would like to help me out a crap load, then hit that subscribe button. It only takes a few seconds and it literally helps me out a ton. If not, then thanks anyway. I'm glad that you decided to watch this video of mine, and it still means the world to me that you're just here watching the video. Anyway, without all further ado, let's get into the rest of the video. The Age of the Shinigami arc is filled with a very rough, edgy art style. This shifts to a very comedic artwork quite frequently. You can tell that through this arc, Kubo was still deciding on his art style for the story of Bleach. And while the lines are very rough, it still makes for some unique and interesting artwork. The art style made it very expressive. And by that I mean you go from seeing peak badassery Ichigo to comedy Ichigo in a flash. And it just works for the tone of the art. Kubo during this period of time made most of his characters have very sharp and noticeable chins. The chins were very restrictive by nature, but keep in mind this is not necessarily a bad thing. It does create some very great panels that really fit the expressions used throughout the art. The artwork fits the high school tone of the story, and that's very important. The first arc needed a style that could switch easily between a high school comedy to a very serious aesthetic, and Kubo picked the perfect one. Keep in mind, as time goes on throughout this arc, Kubo does loosen the chins a little bit, the artwork becomes less restrictive. Anyway, besides the chins, the most notable art style in early Bleach is the simplistic to highly detailed artwork. The majority of chapters have several panels where the characters are lightly detailed, almost simplistic by nature. However, every few panels, Kubo would throw in a highly detailed, realistic panel for dramatic emphasis on a scene, and it works extremely well. The shadow art is absolutely insane in this arc. However, despite all these praises, when it comes to the artwork of Bleach, this arc is by far its weakest. Following the Agent Shinigami arc, we have the Soul Society arc, and it's here where Kubo truly finds his art style. His lines become far more defined, and his faces become far more detailed. The movements are insanely easy to follow with Kubo's lines, even as early as his fight against Ikaku. And while this art style picks up some stuff from the first arc, he defines it differently, and in all honesty, it's vastly superior, and becomes far more detailed and darker by nature. When we would occasionally see a ton of detail in the first arc, the second has far more consistent detail, and can express fear far more easily, especially by using his line drawings. When he displays spiritual pressure on his characters, it's so heavily detailed and conveys the feeling of terror perfectly, especially with Ichigo versus Kenpachi. You can really get a sense of Ichigo's resolve throughout the entire battle by just looking at Ichigo's facial expressions. Kubo really improves his character faces in this arc and is able to draw emotions of fear, sadness, and even the concept of resolve far better. Quick note, this is not to discredit the expressions in the first arc, because even there Kubo did a great job, it's just they become far more defined in this arc. Later on, Kubo eventually perfects this style, however it is still great from this start point and it just continues to get greater and greater. One thing I did not mention in the first arc is Kubo continues to be able to tell an entire story in a single eye. In the Soul Society arc, Kubo's eyes are either extremely detailed or very loose and free-spirited. He uses both to bring his designs into conveying the story well. Kubo's detail becomes absolutely insane starting in this arc. I mean, this is best seen in some of the panels, especially White's introduction, having the detail of the fake smile that's only revealed in the shadow of his face on his Zanpakuto. Here's more examples as well. We also get massive design improvements from Kubo throughout this arc. For example, taking Renji's old appearance and his Soul Society appearance, you can see the detailed difference from a mile away. Again, this is not to discredit any artwork that he did in the first arc, but by the second arc, I feel like Kubo truly discovered the manga he wanted to write, and you can see that especially through this art change. After the Soul Society arc, we enter probably the smallest change in style, being the Arrancar arc. Honestly, the main addition here is the artwork adapts to a much darker aesthetic, but Kubo still uses a similar style of drawing to meet this aesthetic. He obviously has improved heavily. If the Soul Society arc was Kubo's experiment for Bleach's art style, the Arrancar arc is his final paper. And I'm serious with this. All throughout the arc, the artwork really starts to tell you a lot more. Take Ukiura versus Ichigo for example. You can feel the emptiness from Ukiura's edgy design by simply taking a look at it. His plainless expression brings this feeling of absolute nothingness, and upon Ichigo's death, Ohime's facial expressions perfecting her sense of fear, blame, and general hopelessness. She doesn't know what to do, and you can feel that by simply looking at the artwork presented to you. Her eyes as they tremble while she watches Ichigo being consumed by his hollow, even prior to Vasto Lorde. And because of the aesthetic of the art change as he becomes the monster, Ukiura's death impacts even more emotions from the audience. And through this artwork, it tells an entire story. But you get the point. Another good example is Stark, as he really brings this aesthetic of solitude, not just in dialogue but also in design, and facial expressions as well. The emotions mostly all thanks to the extra detail in the characters, especially their faces, body language, and the lack of or less detailed backgrounds. One of the things that's very popular to bash in the story of Bleach is Bleach's less backgrounds, and I really don't understand this, as in my opinion, this helps his characters stand out far more. It helps us to get that storytelling perspective on his characters, as their heart and their personality just stands out so much better. Bleach's art style, especially in the Arrancar arc, has mostly clouds for the background or nothing at all. And this has never meant that Kubo can't draw backgrounds, because when he does, they are absolutely insanely well done. I'll even show some examples on screen now. However, usually he chooses not to put them in, and this is actually all explained in an interview with Tite Kubo. Kubo says, "Backgrounds distract the reader from what's going on inside the character. Whenever I leave backgrounds out, this is to allow my readers to see the heart of the character." And while reading Bleach, you can really see this take effect in his artwork. You can truly understand the characters thanks to the less detailed backgrounds, and you don't have to constantly go back and forth. It helps the story read much better. Finally, the last two arcs of Bleach. These two arcs have far more detail in most of the panels, but where Kubo evolves the most in these arcs is his ability to show emotion on faces, and absolute despair as well. Including absolute despair. This is where he draws some of my favorite panels in all of Bleach, and rather than detailing every small detail change, as there's a lot, I would rather analyze some of Kubo's best work in this arc. First of all, starting in the late Arrancar portion, Kubo started experimenting with horror type art. and you really start to see it far more in Fullbring and Thousand Year Blood War. But without all further ado, let's get inside of the Fullbring arc. There are 3 panels that stand out the most to me in this arc. The first one is after Tsukishima turns Ichigo's entire family against him, causing him to have a midlife crisis. Ichigo turns to murder for just a second. For just a second, he considers taking the life of someone, and normally that wouldn't be shocking for a manga that's about the balance of life, especially after what Tsukishima did to Ichigo, but the artwork that shows Ichigo's pure frustration is absolutely incredibly done, and his face just gives you the emotions of anger of someone who just went through the worst event of their life, of someone who has no one left and is just done with everything. The artwork in this arc is so incredibly consistently good, and while the quality of this panel in just art and detail isn't absolutely insane, in fact some would argue several better examples of Kubo's artwork, and especially in the Fullbring arc, the story behind the lines is what's insane. And that is what's genius about this panel. Throughout the story, this is the least expected reaction out of Ichigo, and the artwork genuinely makes you realize that Ichigo is going to kill Tsukishima, and that he is done after all the horrible things that Tsukishima did to him. The second panel that speaks out in this arc is easily one from chapter 459, and after seeing it again, it's good, man, but there's better in the arc. However, once again, the story inside the panel is what makes it so special. After Ichigo just lost all his powers, after finally unlocking them again, he loses them. And it's just him crying while the rain pours down. After the entire series was about him wanting to just live a normal life while being able to protect his family, it's a breath of fresh air, as we had just watched him regain his powers and now lose them again, and now he just wants them so badly it literally brings him to tears. It's almost like he lost a piece of himself, his identity. He wants to be able to protect. His last friend just backstabbed him, and now he's all alone with no abilities, and as the chapter continues, we get one final panel that's better than both of the ones I brought up. He gets stabbed after screaming at Ginjo to give his powers back, and as he turns his head, he sees his father and Kisuke, and for a split second, he thinks even they betrayed him. The expression on his face tells us everything Ichigo is going through and experiencing. As his tears shed, his eyes are filled with so much emotion. It is so incredibly done by Tite Kubo. But before we get into this next section, getting into Thousand Year Blood War, there's one more panel I want to talk about. I know I lied. And this is the panel of Ichigo looking at Ginjo as he kills him in chapter 477. If I've said Bleach eyes at this point tell a story, in this chapter and this panel, Ichigo's eyes tell an entire novel. And Kubo fleshes it out so well as Ginjo's inner monologue is attached to one of the best Bleach panels in the series. Overall, Fullbring's art is consistently unmatched, as Kubo's more defined characters matched with the more consistently darker aesthetic of his art is just insane. And as I just said, the artwork is incredible, with plenty of panels consistently being better in just detail than I showed. However, few panels in manga history handle storytelling better than the ones I presented today. And as the Fullbring arc comes to an end, Kubo continues to improve his art style just slightly in Thousand Year Blood War. Thousand Year Blood War had a similar art style, but it's more so like a continuation with much more shock horror than anything. Back in Arrancar, Kubo experimented with shock horror just a little bit from Aeon and a few other examples, but in this arc, Kubo changes everything, as for the first time he dives headfirst into using shock horror in his manga. And it is the peak of Tite Kubo. I could spend an entire 3 hours diving into hundreds of panels with an entire story behind them. Heck, I am struggling right now just picking a few. Kubo mastered the occasional background in this arc, having some actual 20 out of 10 backgrounds, and literally took his Fullbring style but made it even darker and more emotional. Yamamoto's rage, his death, his Zanpakuto, and all these panels have entire stories attached to just the artwork. Byakuya's quote-unquote death as he is pinned to the wall and is crying, genuinely believing that he is going to die. The Thousand Year Blood War is absolutely insane, with even the panel of Ichigo's arrival. Protect the Soul Society. Unohana vs. Kenpachi having such a despairing dark aesthetic, Kubo truly somehow turned this heartwarming, kind captain into looking like this bloodthirsty murderer. Literally, the panel of Unohana's reveal as the first Kenpachi, as she turns and looks at Kenpachi, is insanely well done. The panel for Bankai, the panel as Kenpachi's skin and shell is burning, with the inner meaning behind that is just absolutely incredible. Ichigo accepting his true identity has to be my favorite panel in all of manga, as you see him accepting himself for who he is, as he realizes that this power is his. Zangetsu is a piece of him, and this panel perfectly illustrates this, as you see the fake Zangetsu and the real Zangetsu behind him. Gremmy's imagination and Aznot's fear ability all create such unique environments as well, and are absolutely incredible. Shunsui's Bankai, Ichigo giving up, and there is just so many more inside of the story of the Thousand Year Blood War. Thousand Year Blood War is Kubo's perfection, and yes, there are some chapters that aren't the best, but overall the art and post time skip is undeniably Kubo's peak. After the end of Bleach, Kubo's art became interesting to say the least. I genuinely believe the man improved in individual art pieces, but at least for Burn the Witch, as much as I enjoyed it, I just prefer his art style for Bleach more. That isn't to say it deteriorated, as the artwork is still insane, but Thousand Year Blood War and Fullborn Kubo just has my favorite panels and has to be his peak in my opinion. It is still far too early to make a judgment call when it comes to Burn the Witch or the Bleach Hell arc, so I'm waiting. I still definitely believe Burn the Witch's artwork is incredible and a 10 out of 10, and that's the same for the Hell arc, because it's still definitely like different and it's evolved in a lot of different directions, but you can tell it's still Kubo. I like it, but it's just not as good as Thousand Year Blood War and Fullborn Kubo in my humble opinion. Anyway, this is the story of the evolution of this story, on how this turned to this, 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 and finally, turned to this. Thank you guys so much for watching.